Okay, so today is Sunday the 6th of February, and again, it's session 10 in the study guide, page 91, still in the book of Daniel. The verse for today, or the verses, it's Daniel chapter 4. The lesson is verses 28 through 37, and it's a theme. The title of the lesson is called Humility Required. Okay, and it says the subtitle is Believers Must Be Careful to Honor God in All Things. And again, you're young. You've probably seen that when you think about the word pride, that it's good to be proud, to have self-respect and self-confidence. It's not good for pride to go to a point where it becomes obnoxious, or to the point that you start attributing to yourself things that you really don't deserve credit for. Okay, so pride it's a good thing, but it can be a bad thing, like lots of things in our lives. So I'm just going to read and certainly for people like Cheryl and I, for adults that have lived longer and experienced more things, particularly if you start having some success in your life with whatever it is, your job, your marriage, you're proud of your children, your grandchildren, whatever it is, you always have to be careful about letting that go too far. So the introduction here, it says, pride is such an ugly word. Now, to me, it depends on how pride is used or manifested or exhibited, right? Pride is just a thing. It's like lots of things. A gun, it's a tool, right? It can be a good thing, it can be a bad thing, depending on how it's used. Pride is the same thing. But the study guide says pride is such an ugly word. We may even characterize ourselves as self-confident to avoid thinking of ourselves as prideful. Many of us live life as though we are the ones in control of what happens. Eventually, something will happen in life that causes us to wonder if we are really in charge. It is in those moments that we discover who God is and what our role is in His creation, if we look. And so as I read that, and it's kind of ironic that you mentioned, Tyler, that Aviate Academy, that they've mentioned, my actual group of people. Because as I read this, where it says, many of us live life as though we are the ones in control of what happens. Now, I've lived long enough, and fortunately, I learned a while back that God is in control. Okay, there are a lot of people that maybe don't want to acknowledge it, maybe don't understand God, don't want to know God, that think that they can have an effect. And to an extent, we can have an effect. We want to do things that are going to make our life or our path in life better for us. But when I read this, when it says many of us live life as though we're the ones in control of what happens, eventually something will happen in life that causes us to wonder if we are really in charge. Well, for me, that was about 3 or 4 months ago, right? Living life, all is great, all is well, and then these things happen in your life, and you say, I know how I want this to go. I don't think that my circumstance is because of my pride per se, and I try to equate that to not equate me to Job, but in Job's life, God allowed Satan to work in his life for a reason, for God to teach Satan a lesson. I don't believe Job was exhibiting pride. That's not how the story is told in the Bible. But certainly for those who think that they control every little aspect of their life, that they're not going to get sick, they're never going to die, or they don't anticipate dying, so they don't prepare for their eternal life and things like that. God has a way to open people's eyes sometimes. And make no mistake, whether you're a believer or not, the Bible tells us that, and we talked about this during the sanctity of life, God knew us before we were formed. He knew our whole story. Our days are numbered. He knows when we're going to take our last breath, whether people believe in Him or not. God does know that, which should compel us to think a little bit farther ahead than today, right? But to get back to this pride thing today. So the story that we're going to go over today is, again, from Daniel 4. and it's about Nebuchadnezzar. And this is uh, where this is near the end of Nebuchadnezzar's reign as a king. And it says in our study guide that Nebuchadnezzar was a powerful king. I can't remember if it says the word good, because it's interesting how Nebuchadnezzar at different times acknowledged God, but not completely. And there's a great example of that in today's lesson. So as far as background, uh, remember that Nebuchadnezzar had already acknowledged God twice. Okay. And the second time was, as we talked about, when Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were in the furnace. And Nebuchadnezzar saw four men in the fire and said, "Who's the fourth one in there? It looks like he's the Son of God, or a son of a God," depending on how the translation went. What was interesting, and the study guide explains this, when I hear that, I think, okay, when they came out of the fire, Nebuchadnezzar made a decree that said, their God is the God. And to me, I think, okay, Nebuchadnezzar, he's on the right track. He finally, that's what opened his eyes to see who God was. Well, that wasn't the end of his relationship with God, or God using Nebuchadnezzar for God's purposes. We'll talk about how that was in a few minutes. So Nebuchadnezzar, remember, he had a dream that Daniel had interpreted for him. And so that was his first interaction, was that Daniel told him about it. The first dream, he told him what the dream was and then explained it to him. Well, he has a second dream, and he says he summoned his wise men to tell him about it. As in the first dream, they couldn't, and so he asked Daniel to explain it. And it says his dream was about a tree. And we'll kind of walk through that here in chapter 4, the first part of it in just a second. But it says the dream was about a tree. It was a tall tree. It flourished. All the creatures of the field ate from it, so it had produced a lot of fruit. It was a very good tree. It provided shade for all the animals. The birds had a home in it. And so as Nebuchadnezzar's having this dream, he sees this tree, and he doesn't really understand what this tree represents. But then it says in the dream, a holy one came from heaven to have the tree cut down, leaving a stone. All right. So when Daniel comes to explain this, and we'll look at it here. So Nebuchadnezzar, it's interesting. This is written in Nebuchadnezzar's voice, right? You see in verse 4, I, Nebuchadnezzar, was at rest in mine house. So this is Daniel relaying what Nebuchadnezzar told him. And he saw a dream which made him afraid, there in verse 5. And the thoughts upon my bed and my visions of my head troubled me. When he had this dream, he knew it meant something, and it troubled him because he wasn't sure what it meant. So he made a decree in verse 6 to bring the wise men in, that they could interpret the dream for him, just like before. The magicians, the astrologers, the Chaldeans, his wise men, the soothsayers, they came in, he told them the dream, but they couldn't interpret it, just like before. So, but at the last, in verse 8, Daniel came in before me, whose name was Belteshazzar, according to the name of my God. So remember, Daniel's name was Daniel, and it had a Hebrew relationship some way to God. When they were taken into exile, they were given different names. Remember, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were renamed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and Daniel was renamed to Belteshazzar, and it says, according to the name of my God. So it gave them Babylonian names that were related to one of their many gods, apparently. But anyway, so Daniel comes in before him, and you can see it says, and in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. And before I told him, and before him, I told the dream. And he said, okay, Belteshazzar, I know that the spirit of the holy gods, meaning the God, is in you. No secret troubles you. There's nothing, God will not keep a secret from you. So tell me the interpretation of the dream. And he explained what he saw. A great tree in the midst of the earth, great height. Verse 11, the tree grew and was strong, and the height thereof reached unto heaven. This was a big tree, the sight thereof to the end of the earth. From the tree, you could see all over the earth. Okay? And I'll just kind of go through the interpretations as we go here. This is representing, of course, Nebuchadnezzar. He is this tall, this king that's the king, and because the height of his tree, his kingdom, can see all the earth, that's kind of saying he's reigning over the earth as it existed then. All right, in verse 12, the leaves thereof were fair, the fruit thereof much. It was an abundant tree, and it was meat for all. The beasts had a shadow under it. The fowls of the heaven dwelt in the boughs thereof, and all flesh was fed of it. So it was a successful tree or a successful kingdom. Now, in verse 13, he sees a watcher, and a holy one came down from heaven, cried aloud, and said thus, hew down the tree, cut off his branches. So this tree is being cut down, right? So as we think about what it represented, as Daniel explains, this is Nebuchadnezzar being cut down. He's going to lose his kingdom. And Daniel had said in the second dream, in the first dream, when there was the image of the man, it was gold, and then silver in the arms and the chest, and then it was brass, and then, as it went down, iron and clay. Daniel had told Nebuchadnezzar, this is God telling you that you're a great king as far as powerful, and then following you, the kingdoms are going to be a little bit less and less powerful than you. And ultimately, God will conquer the earth as the stone came out of the mountain. So God had already warned him that at some point his kingdom was going to fall. And of course, you have to realize that as a human, you're not going to live forever. But anyway, so this messenger came down from heaven and said, hew down the tree and cut off its branches, shake off its leaves and scatter its fruit. Let the beasts get away under it and the fowls from its branches. So Nebuchadnezzar is telling Daniel, here's what I saw in my dream. Nevertheless, leave the stump of his roots in the earth, even with a band of iron and brass and the tender grass of the field, and let it be wet with the dew of heaven, and let his portion be with the beasts and the grass of the earth. Let his heart be changed from man's, and let a beast's heart be given unto him, and let 7 times pass over him. Okay? Now, so there's the dream, and Daniel interprets it for him. Here, starting in verse 19. And he says, the dream... he says at the end of verse 19 there, Belteshazzar answered and said, my Lord, the dream be to them that hate thee, and the interpretations thereof to thine enemies. Meaning, I wish this was not about you. I wish it was against those who hate you and your enemies. Unfortunately, this dream is about you. In verse 21, in verse 20, the tree that you saw, which grew and was strong, and whose height reached to the heaven, and sight thereof to the earth, and it describes all the goodness about it. In verse 22, that's you, O King Nebuchadnezzar, that has grown and become strong. For your greatness is known and reaches unto the heaven, thy dominion to the end of the earth. You are the king of everything. But when you saw this watcher and holy one come down from heaven, here's the interpretation. And this is the degree of the Most High, meaning, of course, God, which is come upon my Lord the King, that they shall drive thee from men. So when you think about it, said he had a place in the field, and the dew was going to be on him. Anybody remember hearing this story about what Nebuchadnezzar ended up happening to him? Well, you're going to find out here. Verse 25, they shall drive thee from men, and thy dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field. And they shall make thee to eat grass as oxen, and they shall wet thee with the dew of heaven, and 7 times, or 7 years is what that meant, shall pass over thee, till thou knowest that the Most High ruleth in the kingdom of men, and giveth it to whomsoever he will. So God is going to take away Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom. He's not going to kill him. He's going to take away his kingdom, and he's going to dwell with the beasts of the field, and eat grass as oxen, and shall be wet with the dew of heaven, because he's going to be living outside for 7 years, until you know that the Most High ruleth in the kingdom of men, and giveth it to whomsoever he will. So Nebuchadnezzar, remember at the end of when Daniel interpreted his first dream, he said, oh, Daniel, your God is a powerful God, because he helped you interpret the dream, to see it and interpret it. And then with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, he made a decree that people need to acknowledge their God. Apparently God was still going to teach Nebuchadnezzar some more lessons. Then it says in verse 26, and whereas they commanded to leave the stump of the tree roots, your kingdom shall be sure unto thee, after that thou shalt have known the heavens do rule. So what that means is, normally, if you think about it, if you're going to remove a tree, you cut it down, you take the stump out, the tree's gone. It's the stump, the roots are all gone. They're going to leave the stump and the roots, and that's because Nebuchadnezzar is not finished being the king. He's going to get a 7-year break. That's going to be kind of odd, but he will be restored. All right. Now, the lesson for today, the verses are 28 through 37. So let me just read this. Now that Daniel has told him the interpretation of the dream, here's how it's fulfilled, as you can see there in before verse 28. So it says, all this came upon the king Nebuchadnezzar. So this is the fulfillment of that dream. Here's how and why it happened. All this came upon the king Nebuchadnezzar. At the end of 12 months, he walked in the palace of the kingdom of Babylon. And the study guide says this 12 months is 12 months after Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So about a year after he had witnessed what had happened with them. He's walking around in the palace of the kingdom of Babylon. Verse 30, the king spake and said, is not this great Babylon that I have built for the house of the kingdom by the might of my power and for the honor of my majesty? So remember that pride word? There you're seeing it. Verse 31, while the word was in the king's mouth, which means immediately, while the word was in the king's mouth, there fell a voice from heaven saying, O King Nebuchadnezzar, to thee it is spoken, the kingdom is departed from thee. And they shall drive thee from men, and thy dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field, and they shall make thee to eat grass as oxen, and 7 times shall pass over thee, until thou know that the Most High ruleth in the kingdom of men, and giveth it to whomsoever he will. The same hour was the thing fulfilled upon Nebuchadnezzar, and he was driven from men, and did eat grass as oxen, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, till his hairs were grown like eagle's feathers, and his nails like birds' claws. And at the end of the days I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted up mine eyes unto heaven, and mine understanding returned unto me, and I blessed the Most High, and I praised and honored him that liveth forever, whose dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom is from generation to generation. All the inhabitants of the earth are reputed as nothing, and he doeth according to his will in the army of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth, and none can stay his hand or say unto him, what doest thou? At the same time my reason returned unto me, and for the glory of my kingdom mine honor and brightness returned unto me, and my counselors and my lords sought unto me, and I was established in my kingdom, and excellent majesty was added unto me. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the King of heaven, all whose works are truth, and his ways judgment, and those that walk in pride he is able to abase. So those are the verses of Nebuchadnezzar, his story when this vision was fulfilled. So just as Daniel had explained to him, it's interesting how Daniel, in the previous verses, Daniel explained it, and then when Nebuchadnezzar's walking around puffing up his chest and thinking about, man, look at all I've made. This beautiful palace, this kingdom that I have, and it's was made by the might of my power, in verse 30, and for the honor of my majesty. I did all this because I'm so strong, and it was to glorify me. So immediately, a voice comes from heaven, just like it was in the dream. Someone came from heaven and spoke to him, and the words that are said from that person in heaven are verbatim what Daniel had said was going to be said. All right, that interests me. That and again, it was immediate. So, and there's another story after this in the book of Daniel that where God did an immediate thing to the subsequent king as well. We'll talk about it if I remember it. So in the study guide, I'm on page 93, and for starting in verse 28, it says, King Nebuchadnezzar was a great king, meaning not necessarily he was a good man, but he was a great king. He was good at being king. He was powerful. His kingdom was flourishing. He was a great king, but an extremely arrogant person. Have you all seen extremely arrogant people you think are just a little too prideful? Whether it be if you watch professional sports or politicians or, hopefully not many people in your life, but, we're all around people that are can be a little full of themselves at times, right? And just think, wow. Even if they are good at what they do or they're smart or whatever it is, it's kind of off-putting to have someone as arrogant. So it said, Nebuchadnezzar was a great king, but an extremely arrogant person. Even after seeing his God's power revealed in the fiery furnace, Nebuchadnezzar did not change. The judgment God was about to declare occurred at the end of 12 months, following his dream and Daniel's interpretation in the previous verses. Now God had given Nebuchadnezzar time to repent, but would not allow pride in the king's heart to continue. So With this 12 months, maybe that was 12 months after Daniel had interpreted the dream for him. That's what the study guide says. And that would be interesting if Nebuchadnezzar had the dream and Daniel told him what was going to happen, and maybe by this time he had forgotten it. So it's ironic to me that when he's popping his suspenders and said, man, look at all that I am and all I've done because of my power and for my majesty, he was reminded immediately of that dream if he had forgotten. It says, Nebuchadnezzar had attributed Babylon's greatness to his own vast power. Further, he suggested that the purpose for Babylon's greatness was for his own majestic glory. In our lives, anything that we do, that we have, any manifestation of our success, anything that we do is success that is successful, whether it be on a test, sports, the things that we like to do, play a musical instrument, being able to speak. Hopefully, we give God the credit for that ability, and if we've given ourselves to God through salvation or through accepting His gift of salvation, it's all His anyway, and He's letting us. That's why we tithe, is we give back a portion of the things that He's given us. Everything that I own, that I have, is God's. He's allowing me to use it. Hopefully, I'm a good steward of it, and then I give a portion of that back in a tithe, right? But Nebuchadnezzar again was puffing himself up. Now it says both the Old and the New Testaments remind us that our boasting should be in God, not in ourselves. Pastor mentioned this just the other night, I think on Wednesday night, of how the disciples, when Jesus gave the disciples the power to go out into the countryside and heal, to do the things that Jesus also did. They could cast out demons. They could heal sick people. They came back and they said, wow, that was pretty awesome that we're able to do that. And Jesus told them, and this is paraphrased, but he told them, don't boast in what you can do. I did not give you that power so that you can boast in yourself or even in the boast in the things that God has allowed you to do. The only thing that you should ever boast about is that your name is written in heaven, right? That's something to boast about because that's, again, a manifestation of God's gift, eternal gift for us. So it says again, both the Old and New Testaments remind us that our boasting should be in God, not in ourselves. We dare not take the credit for what God has done. Okay. So now again in verse 31, while the word was in the king's mouth, so this was instantaneous, there fell a voice from heaven, just like the dream had said, saying, O Nebuchadnezzar, to thee it is spoken, the kingdom is departed from thee. Saul had the same thing happen to him. Samuel told him, you made a mistake, and God is going to take your kingdom away. And then David ended up being the next king, but Nebuchadnezzar was told, the kingdom is departed from thee. It says, for the next 7 years, he would feed on grass like cattle, just as the dream had said. He was driven out of his land and made to adapt to the ways of the animal kingdom. So literally, I picture him living in a field, maybe with cattle, but certainly like them, eating grass, I guess. It says, Nebuchadnezzar, who thought himself superior to all mankind, became less than human. He was like an animal, literally. He was pushed away from his own kingdom, not by man, but by the Lord God. So it says he was driven in the same hour. He was driven from men there in verse 33. He was driven from men. I look at that and to me, that's for some reason his advisors or the people that he was king over drove him out of the kingdom. The study guide says he was pushed away from his own kingdom, not by man, but by the Lord God. I don't know how he was literally driven away, pushed away, but he was driven from his seat, from his power. And he, in verse 33, he was driven from men, did eat grass as oxen. His body was wet with the dew of heaven, again implying he lived outside, till his hairs were grown like eagle's feathers and his nails like bird's claws. I kind of imagine what happens if someone, man or woman, starts living like an animal and neglects to groom themselves, right? They get a little woolly, right? Their hair starts growing long, like eagle's feathers maybe. They wonder if he brushed his teeth. What did he look like? If he didn't trim his nails, they're going to grow like bird's claws, it says. So he was living like an animal. Now, the good thing for Nebuchadnezzar was, and God gave him an out, just so to speak, at the end of 7 years. Now, he was like this for 7 years. At the end of the day, so after 7 years, I, Nebuchadnezzar, in verse 34, it says, I lifted up mine eyes unto heaven, and mine understanding returned unto me, and I blessed the Most High. So, first of all, it talks about in the uh, study guide, I always kind of looked at this as I started to get a little bit more understanding of the Bible, plus with my own understanding, how I would interpret that when I read it, was that it was almost sort of like Nebuchadnezzar went a little crazy, right? He may have lost his mind, sort of, to an extent, because I can't imagine that someone that's of a sound mind out there living in a field with the animals and eating grass and not thinking, this just doesn't seem right to me. I need to groom myself, clean myself. There's something better for me to eat than whatever vegetation he was eating. Maybe when it says he was eating the grass, he was eating vegetables only. I don't really know. But I kind of picture, especially because of what he said there at the end of the days, mine understanding returned unto me. It's kind of like he got his sanity back, sort of how I picture that. Again, that's just sort of how I see that. But in any case, his understanding came back to him, and he blessed the Most High. He realized who God was, blessed him. And I praised and honored him that liveth forever. So now he truly understands who God is, whose dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom is from generation to generation. All right. So let me go back in the study guide. It says, God told the king there was a way of redemption. It was not until Nebuchadnezzar acknowledged God as the ruler over all nations that he would experience peace. The king had previously recognized that God was over other gods. That was at the end of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He said, their God is the God of other gods, right? Which, to me, that I always kind of looked at that as, well, Nebuchadnezzar, he realized who the living God was. That's a good thing. Well, apparently, he limited his understanding of God to saying God was the God over other gods. However, it says in the study guide, Nebuchadnezzar had missed the point of the fiery furnace. God is in control of his creation, including the rise and fall of human kingdoms. And that's what he's acknowledging now. In verse 33, from the study guide, it says, the words at that moment stress the immediacy of his judgment. He was sent out there in the field. And in the study guide, here's where it talks about what his condition was. It says, interpreters have compared Nebuchadnezzar's affliction with various mental disorders. But whatever the nature of Nebuchadnezzar's affliction, it came directly from God. He was afflicted with something, and it came from God. That was God's judgment or punishment, if you will, on Nebuchadnezzar. He was going to spend 7 years out in this field. All right. All right. Now, back up to at the end of those days when he looked up and acknowledged who God was. On page 97 of the study guide, it says, at the end of 7 years, Nebuchadnezzar looked to the heavens, and his sanity was returned to him. Now, that comes from CSB. Let me just read that to you from the CSB version. It says, but at the end of those days, verse 34, I, Nebuchadnezzar, looked up to heaven, and my sanity returned to me. So that interpretation of the Bible, CSB, calls it, that he had lost his sanity. So his sanity was returned to him. Then I praised the Most High and honored and glorified him who lives forever. Okay. Now, the study guide says the king now recognized his place with relation to God. He had been a good king. He had been abased. We think about base. He's taken down to the most base level. He was subhuman, right, living with the animals. He recognized his place in that he was not all that he had proclaimed himself to be. God is sovereign. Looking up to heaven likely indicated his recognition of God's sovereignty. He says, I lifted my eyes unto heaven. It likely indicated his recognition of God's sovereignty. As his first course of action upon restoration, the king praised the Most High. He now honored and glorified him who lives forever. And it says, before God humbled Nebuchadnezzar, the king thought of himself as worthy of such glory and honor. Now he recognized that glory belonged only to the Lord. And again, that goes back to in our lives when we have successes. Certainly it's a lot easier when we have failures, or hopefully if we have stress or issues, problems, whatever the nature of those problems are. When you're kind of beat down, it's sometimes easier, hopefully, to turn to God and say, Lord, I'm at the end. I've tried everything I can to fix this problem, but I can't. I don't know where else to turn. My friends can't help me. My parents can't help me. My whoever can't help me. I need you. Now, hopefully we would do that first, because God is the one that we should turn to. But in good times, it may be even easier for us to forget, to acknowledge God for the things we have, or to turn to Him in praise and worship and thanks, right? So it says, before God humbled him, the king thought of himself as worthy of glory and honor. Now he recognized the glory belonged only to the Lord. In our lives, hopefully, we give all glory to the Lord and thank Him for all that He's given us and all He's done for us. All right. And in this part of Nebuchadnezzar's recognition, it says in the study guide, first he said of the Lord, his dominion is an everlasting dominion. Nebuchadnezzar's dominion was temporary. He knew that. He wasn't going to last forever. But God, he acknowledged that God's dominion was everlasting. Second, Nebuchadnezzar affirmed God's kingdom is from generation to generation. A long reigning king might live to rule 2 generations or possibly 3. In the Old Testament, when men lived many, many years, they could go through. I mean, we think about in in Noah's time, when men routinely lived over 600 years, you'd have a lot of kids, right? You could see your kids, your grandkids, your great grandkids. Who knows how many generations you could see? By this time, the years of a man was coming down to what's a little bit more normal, considering what we see today. A lot of the kings of Israel and Judah, they died 40s, 50s, 60s. And it said, the years of a man in the New Testament, it says 70 years, right? And if you live more than that, it's a blessing, but it can also be hard just because you're getting old. So it says, a long reigning king might live to rule 2 generations or possibly 3, but God Almighty ruled every generation. And Nebuchadnezzar acknowledged that at the end of verse 34. Okay, his dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom is from generation to generation. Verse 35, all the inhabitants of the earth are reputed as nothing, and he does according to his will in the army of heaven. It says, the king recognized his smallness in comparison to God's greatness. Furthermore, he affirmed that God does what he wants. God rules the universe, not just a kingdom on planet Earth. Again, in verse 35, God does according to his will in the army of heaven and among the inhabitants of earth, and none can stay his hand or say, and then what doest thou? No one can question God. God is all powerful over the universe, not just the earth. Verse 36, at the same time my reason returned unto me, and for the glory of my kingdom, mine honor and brightness returned unto me, and my counselors and my lords sought unto me, and I was established in my kingdom, and excellent majesty was added unto me. So just as was predicted in his dream, he got his reason back, and for the glory of my kingdom, so he was lifted back up, his honor and brightness returned to me, everything about him, he was now restored as a mighty king, and his counselors and his lords sought unto him, and he was established in his kingdom, and excellent majesty was added unto him. So again, he was restored. It's interesting in the study guide, it says, we do not know exactly how Nebuchadnezzar reclaimed his throne. Perhaps his son had ruled in his place during these 7 years. The Bible doesn't explain that. There were 7 years of no Nebuchadnezzar. There had to be a king, right? Because if there's a vacuum, somebody's going to fill that, wants to wield that power, have that power. So God somehow established a 7-year placeholder, at the end of which Nebuchadnezzar was restored. He says, when Nebuchadnezzar again took the throne, he testified that even more greatness came to me. And at the end of verse 36, that's where it says, excellent majesty was added to me, unto me. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol the honor the King of heaven, all whose works are truth and his ways judgment, and those that walk in pride he is able to obey. So at the end of the passage, the end of the lesson, is Nebuchadnezzar praise and extol and honor the King of heaven, all whose works are truth and his ways judgment. And those that walk in pride he is able to abase. I wonder when I read the end of that, again, this is the third time that Nebuchadnezzar in the book of Daniel acknowledged God. And we don't hear any more about Nebuchadnezzar. Um, does this mean that we'll see Nebuchadnezzar in heaven? I don't know. Because to acknowledge who God is, that's not enough. And of course, in this time, this is Old Testament time, so there was no Jesus Christ then. So I don't know. It's interesting to me. The important thing is that he did acknowledge, God showed himself to Nebuchadnezzar in a way that Nebuchadnezzar could not deny who God was. And then just to go back to finish what happened next after Nebuchadnezzar, we mentioned during the 7 years was his son the king. Not really sure. In the next chapter, it talks about Belshazzar, who was, it says, Nebuchadnezzar's son. He calls him his father. This is sometime after Nebuchadnezzar that he is feeling his oats, and he's wanting to have a big party. And he goes, "Hey, go get all those golden goblets," and says, bring the golden and silver vessels which his father Nebuchadnezzar had taken out of the temple, which was in Jerusalem. When Nebuchadnezzar sacked Jerusalem, took the spoils, he took the ceremonial vessels out of the temple that were not meant for people to mock and play games with. Is kind of how I look at it. Belshazzar said, "Go get those things because we're going to feast using those." And if you've ever heard this story, they're having their party, and this hand appears and writes on the wall in this hall where they're at. And it gets their attention, and they try to figure out what these words mean. And the queen, who I assume was, I don't know if it's Belshazzar's mother or his wife, I'm not really sure, but reminded him, "Hey, there's a guy who interpreted stuff for your dad. Call him. His name's Daniel, Belteshazzar." So he called him, and he calls Daniel, and Daniel interprets the words and basically says what these words mean is that God, and I assume it's because he had mocked God by using these vessels and being arrogant and full of pride. He said, what God has said is that he has looked at your kingdom, he's looked at you, he's measured you, he's found you wanting. You are not what God wants, and he's going to take your kingdom away. And that night, Belshazzar died. Okay, so that was another one of those that there was an immediate justice. Okay. All right. Questions or comments on that? Nebuchadnezzar, powerful king, started attributing his power, his glory to himself and not to God because he didn't understand who God was. God got his attention and made him know. For us, certainly in our lives, when good things happen, we should thank God. We should always acknowledge that God is the creator, king of the universe. He's the Lord of all. And and as I said at the beginning, it's good to have self-confidence. You want to have that, but be careful. Sometimes it's easier to see in others, like most things, than to see in yourself. But just be careful when you start feeling so much confidence that it becomes potentially arrogant. All right. Anybody have anything to add? All right, let me stop this. Thanks again for everybody for being here today. There's lots of interesting and good stories in the Bible.